Society of Antiquaries of London, ordinary meeting, Thursday, 25th of November. Meeting at York, St. John University, York. Professor Martin Millett, President and Chair. The minutes of the previous ordinary meeting of Thursday, 18th of November 2021 were read and signed. The certificates of candidates for election were laid before the Society and ordered to be suspended in the usual manner. The following communication was then laid before the Society. The Austin Friary at Hull by Dr. Dave Evans. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be held on Thursday, 2nd of December, and then closed the meeting.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Certificates.
I could remind fellows that I'm reading a shortened version of the certificates. If you would like to have the longer version, do look on the fellows' website. Catherine Ingram Smith, BA, archivist at Charterhouse School, whose book, Charterhouse in 100 Objects, is published next year. Everyone can hear. Christy Bain, BA, PhD, head of the University of Cambridge Research and Collections Programme and tutor at Newham College with expertise in parish church studies. Susanna Lipscomb, MA, MST, DPhil, a historian specialising in the history of 16th century England and France with focus on the intersections of religious, gender, political and social history and material culture. Alice Lyons, BA, MA, an independent archaeologist and post-excavation specialist with expertise in later prehistoric and Roman pottery. James Littleton, BA, MA, PhD, an archaeologist in post-medieval culture, especially early English colonial settlement in Ireland and North America during the 16th and 17th centuries. Lara Meiklin, BA, author and expert on the antiquities of the Thames foreshore and the London stories they tell. Thank you.
Is it your pleasure that these certificates be suspended in the usual manner? Admissions.
The following being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statutes, desire to be admitted a fellow. Tim Allen, Toby Parker, Linda Grant, and Theresa Singleton. Tim Allen. Toby Parker. Linda Grant. And Theresa Singleton.
now come to the main business of today's meeting, which is to hear a paper from our recently admitted fellow, Professor Theresa Singleton. It's a great pleasure indeed to welcome Theresa to the Society. She is Professor in the Department of Anthropology at Syracuse University, New York, in the States, and currently the Pitt Professor of American History and Institutions at the University of Cambridge for this academic year. She comes from Charleston in South Carolina, where she received a degree in sociology and anthropology at what is now Trinity University, then Trinity College in Washington, DC, and a PhD in anthropology from the University of Florida. For those of us who have interest in the history of enslavement and plantations, Theresa Singleton is probably one of the leading authorities in the world. So it's a great pleasure to welcome her today. She has been doing field work and research in Cuba since the mid-90s and has published on that a book, Behind the Slavery Behind the Wall, The Archaeology of Cuban Coffee Plantation. Has also edited a couple of other edited books on the topic, as well as being a prolific author of articles in journals. So it's a delight to welcome Theresa to talk to us this evening on the archaeological heritage of slavery in the United States. Theresa.
Thank you. It's very great to be here and to just be newly inducted as a fellow of the Society of the Society for London and Antiquaries. Yes, we're beginning. The archaeological study of people of African descent in the Americas is now more than a half century old. That began with several isolated projects in various parts of the Americas, Brazil, Cuba, and the United States, and has now developed into one of the most rapidly growing research areas, if not a research field, with its own journal. The Journal of African Diaspora Archaeology and Heritage, dedicated to the scholarship. This study has become, as I said, one of the most rapidly growing areas of historical archaeology. And historical archaeology in this sense refers to the archaeology of the modern world from about the 1540s to the present. My concern in the talk today is to talk about the heritage of this archaeological research on slavery. And heritage conveys many different ideas, and there are numerous perspectives on what heritage means or refers to. And here I use a definition that it refers to the meanings and representations in the present day upon artifacts, landscapes, mythologies, memories, traditions from the past. The archaeological heritage of slavery is primarily focused on the tangible artifacts or the tangible aspects of heritage, sites, landscapes, and artifacts, but it must also consider the intangible, for example, performance, as well as literary works and literary works In this slide, the reenactors here are performing what was called ring shout. It was a religious ritual that was originated during slavery, where the worshipers performed in a circle, shuffling and stomping their feet and clapping their hands with music that was played usually on makeshift instruments such as a washboard. And I'll talk a little bit more, not so much about the ceremony, but about the people or the community, the African American community that practice, or this was one of their traditional practices. Despite the enormous research undertaken on slavery, it continues to be a struggle, however, to designate them as heritage sites, even when they're very well documented or highly significantly, both regionally or nationally. While I recognize this problem is not unique to the African diaspora sites, the situation is slightly different from some other sites in the United States, in that most of the African diaspora or African American archaeology that's undertaken in the United States has resulted from what's known as, or what used to be called, rescue archaeology, and a term I've just learned since I've been in the UK the past 2 months, development-led archaeology. And that is archaeology undertaken where a development project will adversely impact, if not totally destroy, the archaeological resources. In fact, many of the archaeological sites that have been discovered or rediscovered concerning African American history and culture were really unknown to many scholars as well as archaeologists before the redevelopment projects were undertaken. Probably the best example of this is a site that became known as the African Burial Ground in Lower Manhattan in New York City. And it was rediscovered in the early 90s. Although it's depicted on this 1754 map to your left, the initial archaeologists consulted for the project believed that the flattening of Lower Manhattan, it was actually one time a very rolling, hilly landscape. And in the end of the 18th or early 19th century, it was flattened. And this freshwater pond, which became known as the Kolok Pond, that was full. And so with subsequent construction, it was believed that the African burial ground would be totally destroyed. There were plans, or it wasn't until the construction of what's now the Ted Weiss Federal Building that stands at 290 Broadway Street that the human remains were recovered about 6 meters below the ground surface. And this ended up being a situation where they had to excavate before they could continue construction, and over 400 individuals were identified, and they were from the African burial ground. And the analyses of the human remains that also took many years to complete. It's been estimated that probably the burial ground, the entire, at the time in the 18th century, had, or by the end of the 18th century, had anywhere from 10,000 to 15,000 individuals. In studies like the African burial ground, the goal is to retrieve as much information as possible because these sites will not be available for future archaeologists to return to them and do additional field work. The African burial ground is now a national monument as well as a national landmark. The African burial ground, however, is among the exceptions, not the rule, for most archaeological sites related to the African American past. Over the past several decades, numerous African American historical properties have been preserved through the efforts of Black activists, many of whom are the leaders, I would say, or the people who've been the primary proponents for leading this, that these sites are preserved, are usually not necessarily, we're architects. And so the preference has been to preserve historic buildings and historic districts. But very few archaeological sites relating to African American life are listed on or listed on the National Register, which has the most sites. National landmarks, I'm still trying to compile. It seems like you have to go state by state to find out what are the national landmark sites, unlike the other categories. But as you can see that the National Register, it's only about 2% of the total number of sites that's currently listed. And the National Register, I would say too, is probably the least political, or at least to get the sites preserved on the National Register, probably involves a lot less politics than the other three categories, which require a congressional vote. And the President of the United States it's only the last category that the President of the United States can actually identify or propose a site to be a national monument. I have to point out though that these numbers are in flux, partly because there's, there seems to be a process where some sites are being abolished and given back to the states. And then also they're changing some of the categories. National monuments also included memorials, and now that's a separate category. But before I discuss the three case studies regarding the heritage issues surrounding them, I wanted to just first give a very brief, I wouldn't even call it synopsis, but examples of what kinds of information have been acquired through archaeological studies of slavery in the US. Most of the research began when this research began in the late 1960s, it primarily focused on the living conditions of enslaved people on plantations. And the archaeologists had anticipated that they would find evidence of an African heritage, efforts to sort of recreate either in aesthetics or different kinds of objects, maybe musical instruments or whatever, on plantations. But they never really found that kind of evidence. And since that time, archaeologists have proposed certain things, maybe of an African influence, or a reinvention of something comparable to Africa. But the examples are always highly debated. And most archaeologists working on African diaspora sites today, recognize that the lifeways that enslaved people created combine various sources, aspects of Native American life, along with European American ways of life. And so the objects that we find at these sites are a combination of mass-produced, imported objects along with handcrafted items. And in this slide, I'm showing locally made earthenwares that, at least in the southern United States, we generically refer to as colonial ware, a type of ware from the colonial period, because it's primarily found on 18th century sites, although some sites, some 19th century sites, we find it as well, but not as in greater quantities. And the two to your left are the two slides. I'm not to the left, to the right. Those have this roulette. These were only recently sort of rediscovered in collections that, because the vast majority of colonial ware sherds are just plain because they were a utilitarian earthenware for cooking, serving, and storing food. But there are these, at least 3 vessels from 3 different places have this roulette design, which at least one archaeologist thinks may be similar to some African roulette designs. But rouletting is a decorative technique that was used by potters worldwide. Another aspect of this research is really to get a sense of how did enslaved people, what were the kinds of things that they acquired through their own efforts. And by their own efforts, there's a great deal of scholarship that shows that African Americans were able to produce surplus foods, particularly in the Caribbean, but also in the southern United States as well. And with those money they were able to earn, they purchased items from shopkeepers, from peddlers who would go from plantation to plantation selling items. And these are just some of the kinds of things that we find through excavations, but that's how many of these items were acquired, through their own efforts, through exchanges with shopkeepers, other enslaved peoples, that sort of thing, which is sometimes referred to as sort of the informal economy or own account production of enslaved people. Another topic has been focused on various kinds of objects. This is just one of them, Pierce coins, which may have been used as object charms for various types of beliefs. In the United States, these objects are associated with hoodoo, set of religious practices enslaved people and their descendants created from African, Native American, and European folk traditions that included herbal medicine, object charms, protection rituals, conjuring, and ancestor veneration. And here in this slide, you see Pierce coins actually from 3 different sites, including not just an enslaved people or a slave person, but also from a free Black site. That is a person who during the time of slavery was freed either through manumission from, that their owner freed them or they purchased their freedom. So it was a belief system. So the use of, we're finding similar objects being used not only by enslaved people, but also people who were not enslaved, but were of African origin or African Americans. What these object charms were often used for, or the current theme, or I shouldn't say the recurrent theme, I should say, from throughout the United States, but also in Brazil and places in Latin America, is that a lot of these objects were worn for protection. This theme of protection seems to be very important in the belief systems of people of the African diaspora. And then the final object, to just sort of let you know where we are with research on the archaeology of slavery. And this is really quite exciting. And this is from ancient DNA analysis, a clay pipe stem fragment. This is a photograph of the actual pipe stem. They're able to, from the ancient DNA can be used to analyze bodily fluids, particularly saliva and blood. And from the analysis of this particular pipe stem fragment, they're able to determine the biological sex of the user, which was a female, biological female, and also her ethnicity, or her ethnicity was identified as Mende, M-E-N-D-E, a ethnic group that still is found in Sierra Leone, West Africa today. And then this is what one of those pipes, one of those white ball clay pipes would have looked like whole. So these four, the previous four slides just give you some, again, like I said, this is only like a capsules of some of the things that archaeologists are doing or finding and interpreting at slavery sites. But to move on to the heritage issues, the case studies that I'm looking at to discuss those all seem to have come into play this past year, under the lockdown and, for the pandemic. Here I was thinking, oh, this will be a quiet time where I could get some work done. And my phone was just, my phone and email were buzzing about all these heritage issues. And the first one is actually the project I did for my dissertation many years ago. And what happened is that the Georgia State Legislature, or some legislation was proposed. It was given HB 906, that the idea was to give the state legislature in the state of Georgia the ability to sell parts of properties that were heritage preserves or heritage sites, 122 properties. And one of the major ones is Butler Island plantation, which they say here, a sacred site of the Gala Gichi, that they were going to sell for distillery, or to sell it for sale as a distillery. I was shocked because this has been a state-owned and managed property since the 50s. Really, the primary purpose has been to protect wildlife, particularly waterfowl. And so if this had passed, it means that Butler Island would have been sold. But there was so much outrage about the fact that, well, not just Butler Island, but all these sites, Ossabaw, which is featured here, is one of the sea islands and had been donated to the state. And so there was a massive protest that was waged almost entirely virtually, with petitions, and 25,000 emails went out. And so the law was defeated, but the proponents for the law have vowed to rework the wording. They feel like it was the wording that failed, or the wording that they didn't communicate properly what it is they want to do. And so they have vowed to reissue the proposal in the future. So I guess some of you are saying, well, what is Butler Island and why does it deserve to be protected, other than the fact that it was the site of my dissertation? Well, Butler Island, it was one of the largest rice plantations on the Georgia coast. Here is, and if you see it, this whole green area identified on this map as the antebellum coast, was actually known as the rice coast. But it also, in addition to producing rice, it also produced long staple cotton, or what's known as sea island cotton, as well as indigo, or at least indigo when it was still a colony, a British colony, in the mid-18th century, produced indigo. And in many ways, the antebellum coast, or the rice coast, had a lot in common with the British Caribbean. It was a very dense, or a large Black majority population in this area. And there were also ties between South Carolina and Barbados, and ties between business and family ties between Georgia and the Bahamas. So most scholars today think of this area as the rim of the Caribbean, or the greater Caribbean. So the Gala Gichi, who are they? They are the descendants, the African American communities who are descended from this large enslaved population that was there, that lived there in the 18th and 19th centuries. They speak a unique language known as Gala, and they're known for their crafts, religious practices. They were the ones in the slide I showed earlier, the ring shout, that's part of their traditions. And then this beautiful coil basket, or one of the crafts that they made historically and still make today. In 2006, President George Walker Bush he declared the Gala Gichi a cultural heritage corridor, which was a way of trying to preserve the living heritage of the Gala Gichi, who've been dispossessed of many of their lands because they didn't have, they lived on these lands, even after emancipation, but many didn't have written deeds or titles, so the land was easily taken away from them. And they also have limited economic opportunities. So this was an incentive to maybe bring some better living situations for the Gala Gichi. However, the Gala Gichi Heritage Corridor, as I said, it protects the living heritage, not the archaeological heritage or historical properties. And this is just a slide to, like I said, it's a people in a language, and anthropology, we consider a people in a language as a separate culture or ethnic group. These are just a few words: peanut, gaguba for peanut, bakra for white person, jaga for insect. So it's a language that has the intonation and some words from West African languages, but it also has some English terms as well. But I'm not a Gala speaker. It's totally I've heard it spoken, and it's totally incomprehensible to me. And then this is just to show that other than Butler Island, which is on here, other archaeological sites related to slavery have been excavated. And here I talked about, all right, sorry. How do I go back? Oh, yeah, okay. Oh, I guess I didn't talk about where the term Gala Gichi came from, but one of the Gichi part is believed to have come from the Ogeechee River that's up here on the map. So that was the other reason for sort of showing this slide. But this map actually doesn't show all the excavations. So it's an area for which we have a number of sites to be able to provide archaeological data on various aspects of Gala Gichi culture historically. And so then these are just some maps. Photos. This is a fanner basket. This is what was traditionally, the basketry was initially used for making fanner baskets for winnowing the outer shaft of rice from the grain. But then other uses later developed, and here are these big baskets these young boys are carrying. And in fact, there's some evidence to suggest that men actually were the primary basket makers during slavery, and it was after emancipation, missionaries that came into the area thought it odd for men to be making baskets, and so they encouraged the women to make baskets. And so today, most of the basket makers are women, but there are also a few men that still make them as well. So back to Butler Island, this is, this map shows how the plantation was laid out. It's about 1,300, 1,400 acres. I don't know what that is in hectares offhand, but it was divided into 4 settlements, slave settlements, and at its height, it had 500, or an average, I should say, about 500 enslaved people living in these 4 settlements. And when I did the archaeological work there, we actually focused on this one, primarily because 1 and 2 were very disturbed. In fact, the highway goes through it now. And we had difficulty getting to 3. We never really found the slave cemetery, but in the 50s, 2 archaeologists had identified this area, this general area is where the slave cemetery was located. The owner of the plantation, Pierce Butler, he inherited the plantations from his grandfather, and his grandfather, as well as he, lived in Philadelphia, so they were absentee owners that only occasionally came to Georgia, very similar to like places in the British, in the British Caribbean. And in addition to Butler Island, which is up here, he also owned plantations on one of the barrier islands, St. Simon's, which had a planter's residence. And then this other island, Little St. Simon's, at a settlement known as 5 Pound, was where enslaved people that the overseers considered troublesome were banished here. It was almost like some type of prison, slave prison place where they sent enslaved people to be punished. He marries English actress Frances Kimball, and she supposedly didn't know he was a slave owner until after they got married, which is possible because he lived in Philadelphia, which was a very much an abolitionist city. So he probably didn't tell many people, or many people probably didn't know that he was a slave owner. But anyway, he marries her. She writes a travel diary and then publishes it in the 1860s, long after her divorce from Pierce Butler. And then my archaeological investigations, this is such a well-documented plantation in many ways, that I spent as much time doing the archaeology and the artifact analysis as I did going through all these overseer letters, other kinds of reports, census records. This hospital books, there was a slave hospital with 500 enslaved people. You can imagine people were getting sick. A lot of large plantations did have slave hospitals, and I found these books in Louisiana in archives there. And this was after I'd written my dissertation, but I included it in the article that I published. So, and then this map just shows that this is what Butler Island and the surrounding islands would look like. They were marshlands or swamps, and so they had to be totally reclaimed in order to make them viable for agriculture. And this is just showing a base foundation of a chimney. One of the chimneys of the slave dwelling, which would have been a wooden building, but the chimney was brick made from tabby bricks. Tabby was a form of cement that was made from oyster shell, crushed oyster shell, lime, and sand. And one thing that has changed since I worked there was the focus of the historical markers. When Butler Island, this one was put up in 1957, and it emphasizes the slaveholder and Fanny Kimball and the fact that he contracted with Dutch engineers to help reclaim Butler Island and make it into a profitable rice plantation. And you know, it emphasizes the achievement of him and the Dutch engineers. And then just as only in 2019 is there an enslaved-centered marker that talks about the achievements of the enslaved people, or what they did. You know, they did all the labor. They produced hundreds or millions rather of pounds of rice to make him a profitable planter or very rich man, which apparently he lost through gambling. He lost a lot of money, however. And what the marker also points out is that about 400 of the enslaved people at Butler Island were sold in a auction to help Butler pay his debts. And then what I think was the final boost to overruling or HB 906, the legislation that would have resulted in Butler Island being sold, was this letter from former Jimmy Carter, who had also been the governor of the state of Georgia in the 70s. And he pointed out that this legislation was against the Georgia National Heritage Trust Law of 1975 that required that you have public hearings before you can release any properties that became part of that were donated or purchased by the state as heritage preserves. So the sort of second case study then, you know, follows up on was also related to Butler Island. And this is what I just mentioned earlier, the sale of the Butler enslaved people. And here is an ad saying 460 enslaved people were going to be put up for sale. And then this book was published after the sale, but it was from someone who had been an eyewitness to the sale. And so he describes very graphically what went on that day. It became known as the weeping time because, according to the eyewitness account, during the 2-day sale, the skies opened and it was just a violent rain for all the 2 days. And so for that reason, it was called the weeping time. And it's still referred to that today. The weeping time is commemorated at a site in Savannah, which is about 95 kilometers from Butler Island. And it's believed to be the largest sale, not only in Georgia history, but some of the research that's been done more recently is that it's the largest sale, or people are proposing it was the largest slave sale in the United States. And so this is an area where the local community wants to preserve, have a memorial, possibly a national memorial to commemorate this event. And the Weeping Time Coalition, the person who organized it, she gave me a phone call and told me all about the situation. And the problem is that property is being seriously considered, or I should say more than considered. The Salvation Army wants to build a homeless facility on the property, and the people in the neighborhood don't want it. Well, for two reasons. They don't really want a homeless shelter in their neighborhood. But more importantly, they really want to have this place as a green space where they can have a memorial. They're for the past few years, since the historical marker was erected, it's been a place for community activities. In this book, The Weeping Time, that was written by Anne Bailey, she concluded that this was the largest sale of enslaved people in the United States after having done a lot of thorough research. And she's actually identified some of the descendants who were sold off to plantations in Louisiana and Texas. And some of them have since come to the Weeping Times site. Most sales that occurred of enslaved people were usually in buildings like this one, or buildings like these, because usually they were sold in lots of maybe 10, 20, 30, rarely even 50 at a time. And this was a big sale of over 400 people. So the sale took place at a